Yeah, so first and foremost, I do want to say that we have not yet done an impact analysis on the new methodology compared to the ESG scores. We anticipate that there will be less of a divergence, let's say, between the two, simply because the SDGs are using the MSA, so the controversy scores that the ESG scores takes as well. That being said, with the old methodology, we did expect to see differences, and we did also quite often see differences. The reason for that is because ESG scores are ultimately looking at a company's sustainability profile, right? You can look at a big energy company, and from an ESG perspective, they can be very highly graded or scored for their governance. Just because a company is in oil and gas does not mean their governance is not going to be strong. On a social perspective, they probably have very strong human rights policies, especially the very big companies. They probably have commitments in place for community relations, how they're engaging with local communities. They probably pay their workers fairly and maybe don't necessarily have a lot to say on labor rights because there's no child labor that's in place. I'm going to skip the environmental for the example of an oil and gas company, but that being said, 2 out of the 3 dimensions, a company can easily score quite highly on ESG scores because as a profile, the sustainability or ESG profile of the company can be very strong. That being said, on the SDG front, you're no longer just looking at the profile of the company. You're looking externally at the externalities of the company. How does that affect the community? Just because you've got a commitment for community relations on the ESG score front does not mean that were there to be an oil spill, the community wouldn't be negatively impacted. You're no longer looking internally. You're actually externalizing this with the SDG scores. You're no longer looking at, do you have a human rights commitment internally, but well, have there been any human rights abuses internally or externally, right? It's not just looking at the profile of the company, and the scores are really strong. The methodology that we use is actually very robust, but the SDG scores are looking at it from a different angle because you're not just trying to say, is the company as a profile strong across E, S, and or G, but really from an SDG perspective. What is that positive or negative alignment to the targets? So we're no longer centering the company in the middle, but the methodology centers the SDG and around that the companies. So we do expect to see some differences between the two. And I find that if there's a high correlation between an ESG and an SDG score, I would imagine that is for companies in sectors that are already SDG aligned, as opposed to companies that are still transitioning or companies that maybe are not necessarily ESG companies, but from an SDG perspective are doing a lot for the community. The other thing is an ESG score will probably not really measure things like zero hunger or quality education, but there are other SDGs that are more closely aligned to the sustainability performance of a company.